Your garden is full of flowers. The weather is perfect, yet something is missing. The bees that should be buzzing from bloom to bloom have vanished. You planted lavender, sunflowers, and cosmos specifically to attract pollinators. But your yard remains eerily quiet, while your neighbor's modest patch of wildflowers swarms with bees. The truth is, you're unknowingly doing 7 specific things that repel bees more effectively than any commercial deterrent. These aren't obvious mistakes like using pesticides during the day, though that's certainly one of them. These are subtle garden choices that seem harmless or even beneficial, but they create invisible barriers that keep bees away from your property. Understanding these hidden bee repellents is crucial because without pollinators, your vegetable garden will fail and your fruit trees will remain barren. If you've ever wondered why some gardens attract clouds of bees while others remain pollinator wastelands despite having beautiful flowers, you're about to discover the shocking truth about how modern gardening practices have accidentally declared war on the very creatures our plants need most. The 7 mistakes I'm going to reveal affect virtually every suburban garden, and once you understand them, you'll see why the solution isn't more flowers, but removing the barriers that keep bees away. The first invisible bee repellent hiding in your garden is timing, and it's killing more pollinators than most people realize. Every weekend, millions of gardeners grab their spray bottles and garden hoses to apply fungicides, insecticides, and even organic treatments like neem oil or soap sprays. The timing seems logical. Morning applications when dew provides moisture and temperatures are cool. But this is exactly when bees are most active, emerging from their hives as the sun warms their flight muscles and beginning their daily foraging runs. When you spray anything on your plants between sunrise and noon, you're creating a toxic minefield for bees. Even organic treatments become deadly when applied during peak pollinator activity. Neem oil, which organic gardeners consider safe, suffocates bees when they contact treated surfaces. Copper, fungicides, recommended for tomatoes and roses, poison bees that drink from droplets of treated water. Even soapy water, the gentlest treatment available, clogs bees' breathing apparatus when they encounter fresh applications. The solution is devastatingly simple. Shift all garden treatments to evening hours after 6 p.m. when bees have returned to their hives. Most treatments maintain their effectiveness against pests and diseases regardless of application time, but evening applications allow surfaces to dry and treatments to settle before pollinators begin foraging the next morning. This single timing change can transform a bee-hostile garden into a bee-friendly one overnight. But timing is just the beginning. Your choice of mulch, which seems completely unrelated to bee behavior, may be the strongest deterrent in your garden. Cedar mulch, beloved by gardeners for its attractive appearance and natural pest-repelling properties, emits aromatic compounds that bees find unbearable. The same volatile oils that repel ants, termites, and moths also trigger avoidance responses in bees, who associate these scents with danger. Cedar contains natural compounds called thujaplicins and cedrol that evolved to protect trees from insect attack. When cedar bark is shredded into mulch, these compounds volatilize and create an invisible chemical barrier around your plants. To human noses, cedar mulch smells pleasant and natural. To bee sensory organs, it signals the presence of chemical warfare and triggers immediate retreat responses. This phenomenon extends beyond cedar to other aromatic mulches, including eucalyptus, camphor tree bark, and treated pine products. Even synthetic mulches like rubber chips can off-gas chemicals that repel pollinators. The solution requires rethinking your ground cover choices, switching to bee-neutral materials like straw, untreated wood chips, or shredded leaves that don't emit repellent compounds. The third bee barrier is so basic that most gardeners never consider it: water access. Bees require enormous amounts of water for cooling their hives, diluting honey for larval feeding, and personal hydration during long foraging flights. A single hive needs several gallons of water per day during peak season. Without accessible water sources, bees will bypass your flowers entirely in favor of gardens that provide both nectar and hydration. Most suburban properties lack bee-appropriate water features. Swimming pools are too large and deep. Automatic sprinklers provide only intermittent moisture, and decorative fountains often lack shallow access points. Bees need landing platforms and gradual depth transitions that allow safe drinking without drowning risk. A simple shallow dish filled with clean water and floating corks or small stones provides perfect bee access for pennies. The placement of water sources matters as much as their design. Bees prefer water features positioned in partial shade, where evaporation is reduced and approaches are protected from wind. They also show strong preferences for slightly dirty water over pristine sources, seeking minerals and organic compounds that pure water lacks. A clay saucer that collects rainwater and develops algae growth often attracts more bees than elaborate fountain systems. But water access pales in comparison to the fourth mistake that eliminates bees from most suburban gardens: insufficient patch sizes of identical flowers. Modern landscape design emphasizes variety and continuous color through mixed plantings of different species. This creates beautiful displays for human eyes, but represents navigational chaos for bee intelligent systems that evolved to exploit concentrated resource patches. Bees operate on efficiency principles that require large stands of identical flowers to justify foraging energy expenditure. A single bee must visit hundreds of flowers to collect meaningful amounts of nectar and pollen. If those flowers are scattered individually throughout a mixed garden, the bee spends more energy flying between resources than it gains from collection. But when 50 identical flowers bloom in close proximity, that same bee can fill its cargo holds without excessive travel. Research shows that bees largely ignore flower patches smaller than 1 square meter, regardless of the species involved. They preferentially visit patches of 3 to 5 square meters and become intensely loyal to patches exceeding 10 square meters. This explains why wildflower meadows attract swarms of bees, while diverse garden borders with the same flower species remain unvisited. Creating bee-effective patch sizes requires abandoning the designer instinct for variety in favor of pollinator practicality. Instead of planting one each of 12 different flowers, plant 12 of one species in a concentrated group. Repeat this approach with different species in separate areas of the garden, creating multiple resource zones rather than scattered individual specimens. Do you have any large patches of the same flowers in your garden? The fifth bee repellent operates seasonally and catches most gardeners completely off guard: the absence of early spring blooms. Public awareness of pollinator needs focuses heavily on summer flowers when bees are most visible and gardens are in full display. But bee colonies face their greatest survival challenges during early spring, when populations are rebuilding and food sources remain scarce. Most suburban gardens offer virtually nothing for bees emerging from winter dormancy in March and April. Ornamental landscaping emphasizes late spring and summer color, leaving early season gaps when bees are most desperate for resources. During this critical period, bees exhaust winter honey stores while frantically searching for fresh nectar to fuel colony expansion. Tree flowers provide the most important early season resources because they bloom before most herbaceous plants and offer massive flower displays that justify bee foraging energy. Maple, willow, And fruit trees bloom precisely when bee colonies need maximum nutrition input. Gardens lacking early blooming trees force local bee populations to travel increasing distances for food, reducing the likelihood they'll return to your property later in the season. Understory early bloomers like crocuses, grape hyacinths, and winter aconite extend the early season resource base, but only when planted in large quantities. Single bulbs or small clusters provide insufficient rewards for bee attention. Early season patch sizes need to be even larger than summer patches because fewer total resources are available and competition among bee colonies is intense. The sixth bee barrier reveals how modern plant breeding has inadvertently created floral deserts disguised as garden abundance. Hybrid flowers, bred for extended bloom periods, larger size, and unique colors, often sacrifice pollen and nectar production for visual appeal. Double flowers, with their extra layers of petals, frequently contain no reproductive organs whatsoever, offering bees the equivalent of empty food packaging. Rose breeding exemplifies this problem. Wild roses produce simple, five-petaled flowers loaded with pollen and accessible to diverse pollinators. Hybrid tea roses and garden roses feature complex, many-petaled blooms that are magnificent to human eyes but completely useless to bees. The breeding process that creates those layers of petals actually converts pollen-producing stamens into decorative petals, eliminating the protein source that bees need for larval development. This phenomenon extends across most popular garden flowers. Hybrid sunflowers often produce sterile pollen or no pollen at all. Double zinnias, marigolds, and cosmos offer visual impact without pollinator resources. Even flowers that appear single-bloomed may have reduced nectar production due to breeding selections that prioritized other traits over pollinator value. Identifying bee-friendly flower varieties requires looking beyond catalog descriptions and marketing photos. Single-form flowers with visible centers typically indicate intact reproductive structures. Flowers described as good for cutting or long-lasting often signal reduced nectar production, since extended bloom periods usually result from slowed reproductive development. Heritage and heirloom varieties, bred before intensive hybridization programs began, generally retain full pollinator value. If you're learning something new about why bees avoid certain gardens, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more insights into what pollinators actually need versus what we think they want. The seventh and most surprising bee deterrent comes from our attempts to make outdoor spaces more pleasant for human enjoyment. Artificial fragrances, scented candles, air fresheners, fabric softeners on outdoor cushions, and aromatic cleaning products used on patios create chemical interference that disrupts bee navigation and foraging behavior. Bees navigate using complex scent maps that identify flower locations, mark productive foraging areas, and guide return flights to hive entrances. Artificial fragrances, especially synthetic floral scents, jam these navigation systems by creating false signals that lead bees away from actual flowers or prevent them from detecting real floral scents against background chemical noise. The problem intensifies during evening hours when many artificial fragrances become more volatile in cooling air temperatures. Citronella candles, designed to repel mosquitoes, also effectively repel bees and other beneficial insects. Fabric softener residues on outdoor furniture continue off-gassing synthetic musks and aldehydes for days after laundering. Even natural essential oils used in outdoor diffusers can overwhelm bee scent detection capabilities when used in concentrated forms. Eliminating artificial fragrances from outdoor areas requires systematic attention to overlooked sources. Laundry products leave residues on cushions and umbrellas. Cleaning products applied to decks and patios continue emitting vapors long after use. Personal care products worn by garden visitors contribute to the chemical background that interferes with bee navigation. The solution involves creating fragrance-free zones around key pollinator plants while maintaining human comfort in areas away from flower gardens. This might mean relocating citronella candles to seating areas distant from bee foraging zones or switching to unscented versions of outdoor cleaning products. Understanding why these 7 factors repel bees reveals a larger truth about the disconnect between human gardening preferences and pollinator needs. Most garden design principles evolved to please human senses and fulfill human aesthetic preferences, with pollinator value treated as a secondary consideration or happy accident. Bees evaluate gardens using completely different criteria than humans use. They prioritize resource concentration over diversity, efficiency over beauty, and accessibility over visual impact. A patch of weedy dandelions provides more bee value than an award-winning flower border filled with hybrid blooms. This fundamental difference in evaluation criteria explains why pollinator-friendly gardening often conflicts with conventional landscaping advice. Creating truly bee-attractive gardens requires adopting bee perspectives on resource quality and spatial organization, rather than imposing human-designed preferences on pollinator habitat. The rewards for making this shift extend far beyond bee conservation. Gardens designed for pollinator efficiency typically require less maintenance, exhibit better disease resistance, and produce more abundant harvests. Bees and other pollinators serve as indicators of overall ecosystem health, and their presence signals that garden management practices are aligned with natural processes. Correcting the 7 bee repelling mistakes doesn't require major garden renovations or expensive installations. Most solutions involve timing changes, material substitutions, or rearrangements of existing elements. The investment is minimal, but the ecological impact is transformational. Converting spray schedules to evening applications costs nothing but changes everything for bee survival. Replacing cedar mulch with straw or shredded leaves eliminates chemical barriers while maintaining soil benefits. Adding water features requires only shallow dishes and placement creativity. Consolidating scattered flowers into concentrated patches maximizes existing plant investments. Addressing early season resource gaps might require new plantings, but trees and bulbs represent long-term investments that provide decades of pollinator support. Choosing single-form flowers over double varieties often costs the same or less than hybrid alternatives while providing actual ecological value. The fragrance elimination might be the easiest change, requiring only product substitutions and placement adjustments that improve air quality for humans as well as bees. Implementing these changes systematically over a single growing season can transform even the most bee-hostile garden into a pollinator magnet. The effects become visible within weeks as scout bees discover improved resources and recruit their sisters to newly accessible flower patches. The visual transformation is dramatic. Gardens that once appeared full of flowers but remained eerily quiet become bustling with pollinator activity. The sounds of active ecosystems return as bees, butterflies, and other beneficial insects discover reliable resources. But the functional transformation is even more significant. Vegetable gardens experience improved fruit set and larger harvests. Fruit trees produce more abundant crops. Flower gardens develop better seed production for natural reseeding and wildlife food sources. The 7 mistakes that repel bees represent broader patterns in modern environmental management, where well-intentioned actions create unintended consequences. Understanding these patterns helps gardeners make more informed decisions about practices that affect the ecosystems they're trying to support. Bees serve as environmental indicators whose presence or absence reflects the health of entire ecological networks. Gardens that successfully attract and support bees typically support diverse communities of beneficial insects, birds, and other wildlife that depend on functioning pollinator populations. The disappearance of bees from suburban gardens represents a solvable crisis that individual gardeners can address through informed choice changes. Unlike many environmental problems that require collective action or policy changes, bee garden habitat creation lies entirely within individual control and produces immediate, visible results. Every garden converted from bee-hostile to bee-friendly contributes to landscape-level habitat networks that support pollinator populations across entire neighborhoods and regions. The cumulative impact of individual garden improvements can sustain local bee communities that might otherwise disappear from developed areas. The knowledge required for this transformation already exists in scientific literature and traditional beekeeping wisdom. The barrier to implementation isn't lack of information, but rather the disconnect between available knowledge and practical application in typical suburban gardens. Modern gardening education emphasizes plant selection and aesthetic design, while largely ignoring the ecological requirements of the species those gardens are supposed to support. This educational gap creates gardens that look pollinator-friendly, but function as ecological traps that attract beneficial insects to resource-poor environments. Closing this gap requires shifting gardening education toward ecological literacy that helps gardeners understand how their choices affect the creatures they're trying to help. This means learning to evaluate gardens from bee perspectives rather than human perspectives, and making decisions based on ecological function rather than visual appeal alone. The 7 bee-repelling mistakes illustrate how this perspective shift works in practice. Each mistake represents a common garden choice that makes sense from human logic, but creates problems for bee survival and reproduction. Understanding why these choices repel bees provides the foundation for making better decisions that serve both human and pollinator needs. The solutions also demonstrate how ecological gardening often proves simpler and less expensive than conventional approaches that ignore natural systems. Working with bee behavior patterns requires less input and intervention than trying to impose human preferences on gardens' ecosystems. This alignment between ecological efficiency and resource conservation offers hope for sustainable gardening practices that reduce environmental impacts while increasing wildlife support. Gardens that function as habitat provide ecosystem services that extend far beyond property boundaries. The future of suburban ecology may well depend on how successfully individual gardeners learn to design and manage their properties as functional habitat rather than decorative displays. Bees serve as both beneficiaries and indicators of this transition toward ecological gardening practices. The absence of bees from flower-filled gardens represents a diagnostic opportunity that reveals exactly what changes are needed to restore ecological function. Each of the 7 repelling factors provides specific guidance for creating more effective pollinator habitat. Gardeners who successfully attract bees often find that their properties become centers of biological activity that enhance the quality of life for both human residents and wildlife communities. The sounds, movement, and productivity of active ecosystems create more engaging and satisfying garden experiences than static decorative landscapes. The transformation from bee-hostile to bee-friendly gardening represents a return to partnership with natural processes rather than domination of them. This partnership approach typically produces better results with less effort while supporting the ecological networks that all life depends on. Understanding and correcting the 7 mistakes that repel bees is a practical first step toward ecological gardening that can guide more comprehensive habitat creation efforts. Bees provide clear feedback about habitat quality, making them ideal teachers for gardeners learning to create functional ecosystems. The investment in bee-friendly gardening pays dividends in increased harvests, reduced pest problems, and enhanced biodiversity that makes gardens more resilient and productive. Most importantly, it connects gardens to the larger ecological networks that sustain regional wildlife populations. The 7 solutions transform gardens from ecological liabilities into ecological assets that contribute to landscape-level conservation while providing immediate benefits to garden owners. This transformation is within reach for any gardener willing to see their garden through bee eyes and make simple changes that accommodate pollinator needs. Tell me in the comments if you've noticed any of these 7 bee repelling factors in your own garden and which ones you plan to change first. Subscribe to the channel for more practical insights into creating gardens that actually support the wildlife we want to attract.